The stagecoach came down out of the Bitterroot foothills on an August afternoon in 1879, and the dust it raised hung in the air like the last breath of summer itself. Montana Territory stretched out in every direction, a country so wide a man could lose his own name in it, and the sky above Red Creek burned the color of a blacksmith's fire gone low. The coachman hauled back on the brake. Wood groaned against wood. The six horses snorted lathered white, their hides trembling from the long pull out of Cheyenne. Dust rolled forward and settled slow over the plank sidewalks of the only street Red Creek had to its name, and the men sitting outside Jacobson's Mercantile squinted up from under the brims of their hats to see who the stage had brought them this time. The door opened, a boot appeared, then a hand in a worn leather glove gripping the frame, and then she stepped down. She was a young woman, no more than 24 by the look of her, though something in her eyes made her seem older than any woman ought to be at that age. She wore a riding habit the color of dark wine, the wool gone dusty from 7 days on the trail. Her hair was black as a crow's wing, thick and coarse, bound into a single heavy braid that fell across her left shoulder. Her skin was olive darkened along the bridge of her nose by the sun of hard country, and along the line of her left jaw ran a thin pale scar. Not old, not new. The kind of mark a woman carries when she has met something terrible and survived it. In her hand she held a wooden crate. From inside the crate came the indignant clucking of hens who had traveled too far and were of a mind to say so. 6 of them, Rhode Island Reds by the rust-colored feathers poking through the slats, tired and dusty and alive. The old men on the porch of Jacobson's Mercantile said nothing at first. They had seen plenty of women come off that stagecoach over the years. Some came as brides to men who had written advertisements in Eastern papers. Some came as school teachers or as the wives of soldiers heading for the forts, or as women running from something they did not want to name. But this one was different. This one carried a crate of chickens and a skinning knife strapped beneath her jacket, where her hand could reach it quick. And her eyes held the look of a woman who had buried somebody and had not yet been allowed to cry. One of the old men, a rancher named Harlow, who had lived in Red Creek since the territory was nothing but wagon tracks and Blackfoot country, turned his head and spoke low to the man beside him. "That one didn't come here looking for a husband, Jim. That one came here looking for somebody who owes her." The other man said nothing. He just watched her. Her name was Cordelia Ashworth. Most of what she had left in the world was in that wooden crate and in a leather-bound journal she carried tucked into the belt at her waist. She had been a wife once. She had been going to be a mother once. Both of those things had been taken from her on a single night 6 months ago, and she had come 2,000 miles to find the men who took them. And she had come because a dead man she loved had told her before he died to find another man in Montana Territory by the name of Thornberry. She did not know yet that Thornberry was waiting for her. She was about to find out. She set the crate down on the plank sidewalk. The hens complained. She looked up and down the street, slow and careful, the way her father had taught her to read a forest before stepping into it. Observe everything. Record everything. Trust no one until the truth proves itself. That was what Edmund Ashworth had told his daughter when she was 12 years old, and it was the reason Cordelia Ashworth was still alive. She picked up the crate again and carried it into Jacobson's Mercantile. The inside of the store smelled of molasses and leather and pipe smoke and old wood. A heavy man in a stained apron stood behind the counter. Barrels of flour and sugar leaned against the walls. Bolts of cheap calico and dark wool were stacked on open shelves. At the back of the store, near a potbelly stove that held no fire in this season, an old woman sat in a straight-back chair with a shotgun laid across her knees and a pair of iron-rimmed spectacles perched low on her nose. The old woman looked up as Cordelia came in. Her eyes were gray and quick. "You'll be the Ashworth woman," the old woman said. Cordelia stopped. The crate grew heavy in her hands. Out on the street, she had been a stranger. Inside the store, she was already known. "I am," Cordelia said. "How did you come by my name?" "I came by it 2 weeks ago," the old woman said. "My name is Hetty Blackwell. I own the boarding house at the end of the street." I have lived in Red Creek for 32 years, and I know every letter and every wire that comes through the telegraph office on account of my late husband having owned it before he died. 2 weeks ago, a wire came for me from a man named Silas Thornberry. He asked me to watch for a young woman by the name of Ashworth and to send her onto his ranch at Whispering Pines when she arrived. He said he had an old debt with her family. She reached into a pocket of her apron and drew out a folded slip of yellow paper and laid it on the counter. Cordelia set the crate down. She walked to the counter. She read the telegram. She read it again. Her hand began to tremble, which was a thing that had not happened to her in 6 months, not since the night her husband had been killed. She pressed her hand flat against the wood of the counter to still it. "He is expecting me," she said, and her voice had gone thin. "He is child, and I believe there is a piece of your story you have not yet learned." Before Cordelia could answer, the bell above the door sounded. A shadow fell across the floor. Every man and woman in the mercantile stopped what they were doing and turned to look. A tall man had stepped into the store. He wore a long charcoal duster coat that hung almost to his boot tops, open and loose the way a man wears a coat when he does not want anything to catch at his hands. Beneath it, he wore a collarless black shirt buttoned to the throat. His trousers were dark slate wool tucked into tall cavalry boots, and on the heels of those boots were silver spurs worn soft from years of use. On his hip rode a gun belt set low and oiled, and the holster had the shine of a thing touched 1,000 times. His hair was black and streaked with early silver at the temples. His face was long and lean, the jaw clean-shaven and set hard, and above his left eyebrow ran the thin white line of an old cut. His eyes were deep set in the color of green river water under shadow, and when they settled on a thing, they did not blink and they did not wander. He took off his hat when he came through the door. He held it in his left hand, which was missing the tip of the ring finger. The whole mercantile was silent. Even the hens in the crate had gone still. He looked at Cordelia. His eyes moved from her face to the wooden crate at her feet, to the hand she still held pressed against the counter to steady herself. When he spoke, his voice was low and carried the roughness of a man who did most of his talking alone. "Mrs. Ashworth," he said, "I have been waiting for you." She looked at him. She had traveled 2,000 miles and had imagined this moment in a dozen different ways, and not one of them had been this. "Mr. Thornberry," she said, "you know who I am." "I know who your husband was," he said, "Lieutenant Theodore Ashworth. He wrote to me 3 months ago from Wyoming. He told me there were men watching him, and he asked me if anything should happen to look after his wife. I wrote back the same day to tell him that I would. But my letter did not reach him in time. He was already dead." Cordelia felt her knees go soft. She gripped the counter harder. The floor of Jacobson's mercantile seemed to tilt a half-degree beneath her boots. "Teddy knew you," she said. "Mrs. Ashworth," Silas Thornberry said, and his voice was gentler now, though it had lost none of its weight. "Your husband saved my life at the Battle of Antietam in September of 1862. My horse had been shot out from under me. I was pinned under the animal in the middle of a field while the artillery came down around us. A young lieutenant from another regiment broke out of cover and dragged me free. I never saw him again. I did not learn his name until he signed it to a letter 17 years later. When that letter came, I knew that someday you would come to Whispering Pines. I did not know it would be under these circumstances." Cordelia did not cry. She had not cried in 6 months, and she did not cry now. But something inside her chest that had been locked iron tight since the night Teddy died made a small sound like a hinge beginning to give, and she had to look away from Silas Thornberry for a moment to gather herself. When she looked back, he was still standing there, hat in hand, patient as a cliff. "Let me take you home, Mrs. Ashworth," he said. "There is nothing more we need to say in this store. Whatever else there is to say, we will say it at Whispering Pines." She nodded. She picked up the crate of hens. He reached for it, and she did not let him take it. "They came with me from Wyoming," she said. "They go where I go, until I set them down for good. He looked at her, and something in his face that had been set like a headstone softened just a fraction. Then we will put them on the wagon together, he said. The wagon ride from Red Creek to Whispering Pines took the better part of 3 hours. The road climbed west through rolling grassland, where the wind moved through the summer bunch grass in long, slow waves. In the distance, the Bitterroot Mountains rose up gray-blue, their tops still streaked with the last of the snow that never quite melted in the high country. Ravens wheeled overhead. Now and then an antelope lifted its head from the grass to watch them pass. For the first hour, they did not speak at all. Silas drove with one hand on the reins and the other resting easy on his thigh. Cordelia sat beside him with the crate of hens at her feet. The late sun came through the brim of her bonnet and laid stripes of gold across her lap. When they were halfway there, Silas spoke without taking his eyes from the road. "Tell me who killed him, Mrs. Ashworth." She had been waiting for the question. She had practiced her answer 100 times in her head during the long nights on the stagecoach. But now that it was time to say the words, her mouth felt dry. She reached into the inner pocket of her riding jacket and drew out a small scrap of leather. It had been torn from a horse's bridle. Into it had been tooled the image of a black raven with wings spread wide. She held it up so he could see it. "I tore it from the hand of the man who struck me with a riding crop," she said. "Before he killed Teddy, before I lost the child I was carrying, Teddy saw it fall from my hand onto the floor of the house. Before he died, he told me to study that mark. He said it would tell me everything I needed to know." Silas looked at the scrap of leather for a long moment. His jaw tightened. The knuckles of the hand holding the reins went white, and a muscle jumped once in the corner of his mouth. When he spoke, his voice had gone cold and level, and Cordelia realized for the first time that she was sitting beside a man who in his life had commanded other men into fire and come back alone. "Crowhurst," he said, "you know him. Mrs. Ashworth Octavius Crowhurst is the reason I have not slept a full night in 3 years. He wants Whispering Pines for the water that runs through it. He has murdered 3 neighbors of mine in Montana to take their land, and now I know he has reached into Wyoming as well. Your husband wrote to me because he knew Crowhurst's men were circling him. He was trying to warn me at the same time he was trying to protect you. The letter came and I answered it the same day, and I rode to the telegraph office in Red Creek and sent a wire meant to reach him fast. None of it was in time." He looked down at the hand on his thigh at the missing joint of his ring finger. "I owe Theodore Ashworth my life since 1862, he said. "Today, Mrs. Ashworth, I start paying that debt back." Cordelia did not answer him right away. She looked out across the grasslands toward the mountains, and she thought about her father, Edmund Ashworth, dying of lung fever in Boston when she was 18, and about Teddy proposing to her on the porch of her uncle's house a year later, and about the small cabin they had built together on a stretch of Wyoming prairie where the wind never stopped, and about the night the men with the raven on their saddles had ridden in out of the dark. She thought about all of it, and then she put the scrap of leather back into her inner pocket, and she took the reins of her own composure the way she had taught herself to take them over 6 hard months. "All right, Captain Thornberry," she said quietly, "let us go see your ranch." Whispering Pines came into view as the sun was beginning its long slide toward the western peaks. The ranch sat in a bowl of grassland fed by a creek that ran clear and cold out of the foothills. There was a log house of good size with a covered porch running the full length of its front, its chimney built of riverstone. There was a red barn with a loft, a corral holding half a dozen horses, a smokehouse, a root cellar dug into a low hillside, and off to the side, standing alone, the dark shape of a forge, with smoke still drifting from its chimney. And the pines, tall, straight pines growing in scattered groves along the edges of the property, old trees with rough red bark, and when the wind came down off the mountain, it moved through those pines with a sound like a woman whispering a secret she did not want overheard. That was where the name had come from. Silas had chosen it himself in the spring of 1865, the week he and 2 other men had first come to this land. The wagon rolled down into the bowl. A figure stepped out of the forge and turned to watch them come. The figure was enormous. Cordelia had never in her life seen a man so big. He stood more than 6 feet tall and was built like the anvil inside the building behind him. His shoulders were the width of a door frame, his chest a barrel, his arms as thick as most men's thighs and dense with coiled red hair. He wore no shirt in the August heat, only a heavy leather blacksmith's apron, scarred with burn marks and streaked with soot. His hair was a wild crown of curling copper red, and his beard was thick and full, and the same color as his hair. His eyes set deep in a broad, freckled face were a startling bright blue. He was wiping his hands on a rag as the wagon came to a stop in front of the house. "Barney," Silas said, climbing down from the wagon, "this is Mrs. Cordelia Ashworth. She is the widow of Lieutenant Theodore Ashworth of Antietam." The change that came over the giant's face was something Cordelia would remember for the rest of her life. The friendly curiosity that had been there a moment before drained away, and in its place came a look of such solemn recognition that it made her breath catch. He lowered the rag slowly. He stepped forward. And then to her astonishment, Barnaby Kincaid, blacksmith and former cavalry sergeant of the 28th Pennsylvania Volunteers, went down onto one knee in the dust beside the wagon. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice was as deep as a well, "Captain Thornberry has spoken of your husband more times than I can count in the 17 years I have known him. I always wanted to meet the man who pulled him out from under that horse. I am sorry I did not get the chance, but I will stand between you and any harm that comes to Whispering Pines for as long as there is breath in me. That is the oath of a Kentucky blacksmith, ma'am, and in Kentucky we do not give those oaths lightly." Cordelia looked down at the kneeling giant and felt her throat close. "Thank you, Mr. Kincaid," she said. "Teddy would be glad to know there are good men like you in this country." Barnaby Kincaid rose. He lifted the crate of hens off the wagon as easily as a child lifts a loaf of bread. He looked down through the slats at the 6 red bird blinking up at him, and a slow grin broke across his bearded face. "6 Rhode Island Reds," he said. "Captain, we have not had eggs on this ranch in 11 months. Mrs. Ashworth, I am going to build these ladies the finest coop in Montana Territory before the week is out. That is my second promise to you." He carried the crate toward the barn as if it weighed nothing, and the hens clucked in astonished dignity from within. Silas helped Cordelia down from the wagon. His hand was hard and warm and careful. She felt the strangeness of letting a man touch her for the first time since Teddy had died, and she let it pass through her like weather, and then she stepped onto the porch of Whispering Pines and into the house that was going to change everything about what she thought her life had left to give her. Inside, the main room was larger than she had expected. A stone fireplace took up most of the far wall. A heavy plank table with 6 chairs stood in the center. Open shelves along one wall held dishes and tin goods. A cast-iron stove sat in the corner that served as the kitchen. And in a rocking chair beside the fireplace, a man was reading a book. He looked up when she entered. He set the book down, carefully closed it with his finger inside to mark his place, and took off a pair of small, round, wire-frame spectacles. He rose to his feet with the bearing of a man who had once worn a uniform and had never quite forgotten how to stand at attention. He was perhaps 44 years of age. His skin was a deep, warm brown, and his face was lean and thoughtful. The cheeks hollowed, the brow high and lined. His close-cropped hair was more silver than black. He wore a clean white collarless shirt, a dark brown wool vest buttoned neatly, and simple dark trousers above polished leather shoes. A small leather-bound book peeked from his vest pocket and a carved wooden pipe from the other. He carried no gun. He wore no spurs. Everything about him said scholar, and everything about his eye said he had also been something much harder once and had made his peace with the memory of it. "Ma'am," he said, "I am Dr. Absalom Whitfield. You may call me Dr. Whitfield or Absalom, whichever suits you. I live in the small house at the eastern edge of Whispering Pines, but I take most of my evening meals here. Silas and Barney and I have been family for 14 years. Cordelia's eyes went to the book he had set aside. She could just make out the title on the spine. Marcus Aurelius, she said, the Meditations. Dr. Whitfield's eyes brightened behind the lenses he was slowly polishing on a white handkerchief. You know him. My father read him to me when I was a girl. He said the Stoics taught a person how to bear what could not be changed. My father was a naturalist. His name was Edmund Ashworth of Boston. Dr. Whitfield stopped polishing his spectacles. He looked at her with a new kind of attention. Ashworth of Boston, he said slowly. Edmund Ashworth, ma'am, I read your father's monograph on the botany of the Alleghenies when I was a medical student in Philadelphia in the year 1857. I own a copy of it still. It sits on the shelf behind you. Cordelia turned her head, and there on a rough plank bookshelf built into the wall beside the fireplace was a slim cloth-bound volume with her father's name stamped on the spine in faded gold. Something in her broke very softly like a piece of thin ice giving way. She had traveled 2,000 miles from everything she had known into a land she had never seen, to a house owned by a man who was a stranger to her, and on his wall was a book her dead father had written. She did not know whether to laugh or to weep. She did neither. She simply stood there with her hand pressed lightly against the back of a chair and let the moment hold her. Silas spoke quietly from behind her. Absalom, Mrs. Ashworth, is the widow of Lieutenant Theodore Ashworth. Dr. Whitfield went still. The lieutenant at Antietam, he said, the scene. Absalom Whitfield turned fully to face Cordelia. He set his spectacles back on his nose with a hand that had grown unsteady. When he spoke, his voice had gone quiet and careful. Mrs. Ashworth, I tended to your husband in the hospital tent after that battle. He had taken a wound in the left leg. I sewed 17 stitches in him by lantern light. He stayed in my tent for 3 nights. On the second night, when the fever took him for a few hours, he spoke of a young woman in Boston, the daughter of a naturalist. He said he meant to marry her when the war ended. He said her name was Cordelia, and he said her eyes were the color of walnut wood, and he said he had never met anyone who could quiet him the way she could. I remembered all of it because I was a young man far from the woman I loved, and I listened to him speak of you, and I envied him, and I prayed he would live to go home to you. Cordelia's hand tightened on the back of the chair until her knuckles ached. He did live, she said. He came home. He married me. We had 4 years together. I am glad, Dr. Whitfield said softly. Ma'am, I am very glad. Outside, the sun slid behind the bitterroots, and the light inside the log house of whispering pines went from gold to amber to blue. The forge had gone quiet. Barnaby Kincaid was building the first walls of a chicken coop out behind the barn in the cooling dusk. 6 Rhode Island Reds scratched at the new straw of a temporary pen. And inside the house, 3 men who had once been soldiers together stood in a room with the widow of a 4th soldier and the circle that had been open for 17 years quietly closed. They ate supper together at the long plank table. Barney had shot a young deer the week before and smoked the meat himself, and he served it in a rich brown stew with potatoes and wild onions and biscuits that he apologized for because they were slightly burned on the bottoms. Cordelia told him the biscuits were fine. She ate more than she had eaten in any single sitting in 6 months. The food and the warmth of the fire and the steady presence of the 3 men around the table worked on her in a way she had not braced for, and twice during the meal she had to set down her fork and simply breathe until the feeling passed. Nobody pressed her. Nobody spoke of Wyoming or of the raven on the leather. They let her eat in peace. When the plates were cleared away and Dr. Whitfield had poured coffee into tin cups, Silas Thornberry set his own cup down on the table and folded his hands in front of him and looked at Cordelia across the lamplight. Mrs. Ashworth, he said, I owe you the whole truth before you decide whether you want to stay under this roof. Are you able to hear it tonight? I am, she said. He drew a long, slow breath. On the morning of the 6th of April in the year 1862, Silas said, I was a captain of the 28th Pennsylvania Volunteer Cavalry. I was 22 years old. Barney was my sergeant. He was 19, and his younger brother Gideon had enlisted with him and was 17 and carried the colors of our company. Dr. Whitfield was our regimental surgeon. He had graduated from the Pennsylvania Medical College in 1858, one of the first men of his color to be trained as a doctor on the Eastern Seaboard, and he had volunteered for the Union Army as soon as the war began. That morning, the three of us were at a place in Tennessee called Shiloh. The room grew very quiet. Barney, sitting to Silas's right, set down his coffee cup and did not pick it up again. Absalom Whitfield sat with his hands folded on the table and his eyes on the surface of the wood, as if he were reading something written there in a language only he could see. "I was ordered," Silas said, "to take 200 men up a wooded hillside that the field officers called the Hornet's Nest. I knew when I got the order that it was a killing place. I could see the Confederate lines waiting on the high ground. I went to Colonel Peabody and I asked him to change the direction of the attack. He refused. I was a captain. I did what a captain does. I rode back to my men and I gave them the order and I led them up that hill." He paused. His hand, the one missing the joint of the ring finger, had gone flat on the table. Gideon Kincaid carried the colors that morning because he had volunteered for it. Every man in the regiment knew that the color bearer was the first target in any advance. Barney begged his brother not to take the job. Gideon took it anyway. He said somebody had to, and he was not going to ask another mother's son to do it in his place. We went up the hill. The Confederate cannon opened on us when we were halfway up. Gideon was hit by a shell fragment that took him across the chest. Barney reached him before I did. He carried his brother out of that fire on his back, and the shells kept falling around them. And when he got him down to our lines, there was a surgeon's tent set up behind a line of oaks, and inside that tent was Dr. Absalom Whitfield. Silas looked across the table at Absalom, who did not look up. Dr. Whitfield did what he could. He was out of morphine. He was out of ether. He was down to bandages and catgut and his own two hands, and the belief that some of the men brought to him could still be saved. Gideon Kincaid could not. He died in his brother's arms before the hour was out. Before he died, he said he was sorry. He told Barney he was sorry he was not strong enough to hold on. Barnaby Kincaid the giant put one enormous scarred hand up over his eyes and held it there. "By the end of that second day at Shiloh," Silas said, "our regiment had lost 79 men out of 200. I had lost a piece of my hand to a ricochet. Dr. Whitfield had amputated the legs of 3 men on a plank table with a wood saw and no anesthesia, and all 3 of them died of shock beneath his hands. None of the 3 of us was the same man after Shiloh, but we stayed in the war. We fought on, and that September at Antietam, a young lieutenant from a Massachusetts regiment broke out of cover under fire and pulled me from beneath my dead horse. That was your husband, Mrs. Ashworth. That was Theodore Ashworth. I did not know his name then. I would not learn it for 17 years. He paused again. He looked down at his coffee, untouched, already gone cold. When the war ended in '65, we were at Appomattox. We watched General Lee ride out to surrender. The other men around us wept and cheered, and the 3 of us did neither. We just stood there in the mud and felt nothing at all. Barney could not go home to Kentucky because his family farm had been burned by partisans who counted him a traitor for fighting in blue. Absalom could not go back to Philadelphia in any way that would let him practice his profession because the hospitals of that city would not take a colored surgeon no matter what his training. I had no family left. My mother had died of cholera the second year of the war, and my father had died of grief 6 months after her. So the 3 of us on a rainy afternoon in a Virginia field made a promise to one another. We would go west. We would find a place where the ground did not yet know our names. We would hold it together. We would die together if it came to that. And we would never let any one of the 3 of us face the dark alone. He lifted his eyes and looked at Cordelia. "Whispering Pines is not just a ranch, Mrs. Ashworth. It is the place where 3 broken men came to try to put themselves back together. And today the widow of the man who saved my life has walked in through the front door. You will stay here as long as you need to stay. Longer if you wish. We will help you find justice for your husband. That is my oath to you tonight, just as the oath he kept in 1862 was his to me." Cordelia sat very still for a long moment. Then she reached down to her belt and drew out her father's leather-bound journal. She opened it to a blank page. She took up the steel nib pen and the small bottle of ink that always traveled with her, and by the lamplight she wrote a single line in her careful Eastern hand. When she was done, she turned the journal around and slid it across the table to Silas Thornberry. He read what she had written. He read it twice. The line said this: "First night at Whispering Pines, 3 broken men have at last found a reason not to be broken anymore. And I, a broken woman, have at last found a reason to believe in something other than vengeance." Silas looked up at her. For the first time in 17 years, something moved in the back of his green eyes that might have been hope. He closed the journal gently and handed it back. "Welcome home, Mrs. Ashworth," he said. 3 days passed. In those 3 days, Cordelia slept a full night for the first time since Wyoming. She washed the dust of 7 days of travel from her hair in a tin tub behind the house while the wind moved through the pines and the hens fussed in their temporary pen. Barnaby Kincaid framed out the walls of the new chicken coop at a speed that astonished her, working with a hammer that looked like a toy in his enormous fist. Dr. Whitfield rode in from his own small house at the eastern edge of the property in the mornings and sat with her at the table drinking coffee and speaking of books and of Boston and of the changes that had come over the world since 1862. Silas Thornberry went about the quiet business of the ranch with one eye always turned toward the road from Red Creek. On the morning of the 4th day, Barnaby Kincaid rode into Red Creek to buy nails and lumber and a length of copper wire. He did not know it, but he was about to meet Octavius Crowhurst. He tied his horse at the rail in front of Jacobson's Mercantile and went inside and placed his order. While Jacobson was counting out the nails, Barney heard the sound of many hooves coming down the street. He turned and looked out the front window, and he saw 7 riders coming in from the south. The lead rider was a lean man dressed all in black. He wore fine kid leather gloves the color of dried blood. On his coat lapel was pinned a small silver brooch in the shape of a raven with its wings spread. Barnaby Kincaid felt the air in Jacobson's Mercantile change. The riders pulled up in front of the store. The man in black did not dismount. He looked through the window, saw Barney standing inside, and raised his voice so that every soul on the street could hear him. "Kincaid, I hear Thornberry has taken in a new woman out at Whispering Pines. A widow from Wyoming, name of Ashworth. Is that so?" Barnaby Kincaid set down the bag of nails on the counter very slowly. He walked to the front door. He stepped out onto the plank sidewalk into the sun. He did not put his hand near his pistol. He did not need to. His presence was a weapon all on its own. "You hear news fast, Mr. Crowhurst," Barnaby said. "I always hear news fast, Kincaid. Carry a message to her for me. Tell her Wyoming is a long way off. Tell her memory is a thing best left buried. Tell her that if she tries to dig up what has been put down, she will find more bones than she was looking for. And tell her that one of those bones may very well turn out to be her own." Barnaby Kincaid took a single step forward. Just one. It was enough. 2 of the men behind the Crowhurst dropped their hands toward their holsters. "Mr. Crowhurst," Barnaby said, and his deep voice was almost gentle, "I will carry your message, and I will carry mine back. The 3 men at Whispering Pines are not in the habit of handing over women to the men who are afraid of them. And you are afraid, Crowhurst. I can see it sitting in your eyes like a bird in a cage." Crowhurst laughed a thin, dry sound. "I am afraid of nothing, Kincaid. I am only efficient. Good day." He wheeled his horse. His men followed. But at the edge of the street, before he spurred into a gallop, Octavius Crowhurst turned in the saddle and called back over his shoulder one final line. "And Kincaid, mind your forge. Fire spreads quickly in the night." Then he was gone, and the dust he left behind hung in the street like a bad omen. That evening, when Barnaby rode back into Whispering Pines and told him what had been said, Cordelia was standing in the kitchen doorway with a dish towel in her hands, and she heard every word. She stepped out into the main room and set the dish towel on the back of a chair and looked at the three men seated at the table. "Gentlemen," she said, "I have not told you all the truth. I did not come here only to hide. I came here with a plan. I have written a letter to United States Marshal Burke in Bismarck, and I carry it in my journal. I have gathered the names of three other ranchers' widows Crowhurst has left behind him in Wyoming and Dakota, and they are ready to swear to what they know. I came here thinking I could set the law in motion from a safe distance. But now I see I was a fool. Crowhurst will strike this ranch long before any law can reach him. I will understand if you want me gone in the morning. I do not want to bring fire down on Whispering Pines." Silas Thornberry rose from the table. He walked to the window and stood looking out at the dusk gathering over the grasslands. When he turned back, there was something in his face that had not been there before, a settled thing, a decision. "Mrs. Ashworth," he said, "you are not bringing fire down on this ranch. You are bringing a reason to light it ourselves. For 3 years, we have waited for a righteous cause to stand against Crowhurst. You have carried that cause to our front door inside a crate of chickens and a leather journal. We are not sending you away. We are taking you in." He looked at Barney and at Absalom. "Gentlemen, are we agreed?" Barnaby Kincaid stood up. He walked around the table and laid one enormous hand on Cordelia's shoulder, careful as if she were made of something that could break. "Ma'am, I have followed this man through Shiloh and Antietam and Gettysburg and Appomattox. I am not about to stop following him now. I stand with Whispering Pines, and I stand with you." Dr. Absalom Whitfield stood also. He took off his spectacles and polished them and put them back on a small, slow gesture that was his way of closing a difficult thought. "I have buried too many good men in my life, Mrs. Ashworth," he said. "It is time I helped to bury a bad one. Through the law, if possible. Through other means, if not. I stand with Silas. I stand with Barney. I stand with you." Cordelia looked at the three of them, three broken men who had been waiting 17 years for a reason to be whole again. She did not trust her voice, so she did not try to speak. She only placed her hand over Silas Thornberry's hand, where it rested on the table, the hand with the missing joint, the hand that had once been pulled out from under a dead horse at Antietam by the man she had loved. Outside the log walls of Whispering Pines, the wind came down off the bitterroots and moved through the tall pines with the sound of a woman whispering a secret. The 6 Rhode Island red hens had gone to roost in their half-finished coop behind the barn. Somewhere out in the grasslands, a coyote called once and then was still. And in a big house a day's ride to the south, a man in fine black gloves with a silver raven on his lapel was already giving orders to his men for the first of the blows that would soon fall on Whispering Pines. The war that had been waiting 17 years to begin was about to begin at last. The morning after the decision was made, Cordelia Ashworth woke before the sun. The room she had been given was small and clean and smelled of cedar shavings and wool. A window of real glass looked east across the grasslands toward a sky just beginning to grow pale at its lower edge. She lay still for a moment beneath a heavy quilt and listened to the house. She heard nothing. The 3 men of Whispering Pines were not yet stirring. Out in the half-built coop behind the barn, one of the Rhode Island Reds gave a soft, sleepy cluck, and another answered her, and then the henhouse fell silent again. For the first time in 6 months, Cordelia Ashworth woke into a day that did not begin with the question of how she was going to stay alive. She rose. She washed her face in the basin on the small pine stand by the door. She dressed in her work clothes, a faded denim shirt that had once belonged to her father, and a pair of dark canvas trousers she had cut down to fit her own legs. She braided her heavy black hair and pinned it up off her neck. She opened the door of her room and walked quietly through the still house and out onto the porch. The eastern sky was the color of pearl. The bitterroots in the west were still black against the stars. The air smelled of cold creek water and pine resin, and the faint, sweet ash of last night's fire in the stone hearth. She stood there with her hands wrapped around the porch rail, and she breathed it in slow and deep, and she thought about her dead husband. And she thought about three men sleeping in this house who had bound themselves to a cause that would either save her or kill them all. When the first edge of the sun came up over the eastern grass, she went inside and started the cook fire and put on a pot of coffee. That was how the 2 weeks began. 2 weeks. That was the figure Silas Thornberry had set for them. 2 weeks to make the ranch ready to teach Cordelia what she needed to know, to gather the information they would need to keep the surface of life looking ordinary, so that Octavius Crowhurst would not understand he was about to be hunted by the very men he meant to break. In those 2 weeks, Cordelia Ashworth learned the rhythm of Whispering Pines. She learned it in the kitchen first. The kitchen of the log house had not had a woman in it since Silas Thornberry's mother had died in Pennsylvania in 1863, which was to say that the cast iron stove had been used hard and cleaned seldom, and treated as a fire pit by men who had wanted only to get hot food into their bellies and get back to work. Cordelia took it apart with rags and lye soap and patience. She blacked it with stove polish she had bought from Jacobson on her first morning in Red Creek. She scrubbed the kitchen floor on her hands and knees and found cracks in the boards where flour and bacon grease had collected for years, and she dug them clean with the point of a paring knife. By the third day, the kitchen of Whispering Pines smelled of fresh bread and beef stew and good strong coffee, and Dr. Absalom Whitfield, who had come up to the main house for supper that night, set down his fork halfway through the meal and said quietly that it was the best food he had eaten in 14 years. She learned the garden next. The vegetable patch behind the house was a sad ruin when she found it choked with weeds and producing only a few stunted potatoes in a single tough squash. She put on her father's old shirt and a wide-brimmed hat and went after it with a hoe. By the end of the week, she had cleared 3 long rows. She planted late-season turnips and carrots and a small patch of the medicinal herbs her father had taught her to recognize in the woods around Boston when she was a child. She spoke to the seedlings as she tucked them in. It was a habit she had brought from Wyoming. It made the men smile when they walked by. She learned the chicken coop. Barnaby Kincaid had finished it on the second day, and it was a thing of careful joinery with a sloped roof to shed snow and tight latches to defeat raccoons, and a small wire run on the south side where the hens could scratch in the sun. The 6 Rhode Island Reds moved into it like duchesses taking possession of a country estate. Within 4 days, they had begun to lay again. The first egg of Whispering Pines in 11 months was carried into the kitchen in Cordelia's cupped hands as if it were the crown jewel of England, and Silas Thornberry, who had been at his desk in the main room going over old cattle ledgers, looked up and saw it and laughed out loud. He had not laughed in so long that the sound startled him, and he covered the laugh with a cough and pretended he had not made it. Cordelia let him pretend. She learned the men. She learned that Silas Thornberry rose before dawn and went out to walk the perimeter of the home pasture every single morning, no matter the weather. He carried his Winchester loose in his right hand, and his head was tilted slightly forward, and his eyes moved without stopping. It was a soldier's walk. It had been 17 years since the war, and he was still walking picket lines. She learned that Barnaby Kincaid laughed easy and ate enormously and could lift the back end of a wagon by himself if a wheel needed changing, but that there were certain hours of certain days, the days that would have been birthdays for a brother long buried, when the giant disappeared into his forge and worked at his anvil for so long that the ringing of his hammer became a sound like a man's heart beating against the inside of his own chest. She learned that Dr. Absalom Whitfield read every night by the light of a single oil lamp, that he kept his medicines in glass bottles labeled in his own beautiful copperplate hand, that he carried a small leather case of dental tools, because in this country a doctor was also a dentist, and that on the chest of drawers in his small house at the eastern edge of the property there stood a daguerreotype in a brass frame of a young woman with a soft mouth and quiet eyes, and that he never once spoke of her unless asked. She watched these men and she learned them, and somewhere in the middle of the second week, She realized that she was no longer thinking of them as strangers. She was beginning to think of them as people she did not want to lose. That was a dangerous thing to be thinking in a house that Octavius Crowhurst meant to burn down. It was on the morning of the 8th day that Silas Thornberry came to her at the kitchen table where she was kneading bread. "Mrs. Ashworth," he said, "Barney is going to teach you to shoot today." She looked up at him with her hands buried in flour. "I have shot a rifle before, Captain Thornberry. My father took me grouse hunting in the woods of Massachusetts when I was a girl." "That is good," he said, "but grouse hunting is not what we are preparing you for. If the worst should happen and Barney and Absalom and I are not here when Crowhurst's men come, I want you to be able to put a bullet exactly where you mean to put it. Barney is the best shot on this ranch. He will teach you what you need to know." She wiped her hands on her apron. She nodded. "I will be ready in an hour." That afternoon, behind the barn in the long, hot sun of a Montana September, Barnaby Kincaid taught Cordelia Ashworth how to shoot. He set 6 empty whiskey bottles on the top rail of a corral fence 40 paces away. He handed her his own Winchester model of 1873, the rifle he had carried for 12 years. "Forget everything you think you know about shooting, Mrs. Ashworth," he said. "Shooting is not about strength. It is about discipline. You are going to learn to breathe. You are going to learn to stand. You are going to learn to hold the rifle. And only when all of those things are correct, you are going to learn to squeeze the trigger." He showed her. He stood behind her and corrected her stance with hands as careful as a piano teacher's. He showed her how to set her feet, how to seat the butt of the rifle into the pocket of her shoulder, how to wrap her left hand under the barrel without strangling it, how to bring her right elbow up to make a level platform for the stock. Then he taught her to breathe. "You take a full breath in," he said. "You let half of it out. You hold the rest. And while you are holding it, you do not pull the trigger. You squeeze it. You squeeze it slow until the rifle goes off and surprises you. If you ever know exactly when the shot is coming, you have done it wrong." Her first shot went wide and high. The bottle did not move. The crack of the rifle rolled out across the pasture and came echoing back from the trees on the far side. "Again," Barnaby said. Her second shot kicked up dust 2 feet to the left of the bottles. Her third shot cracked the top rail of the fence below them. Her fourth shot took the first bottle off the rail in a spray of brown glass. She turned her face up to look at Barnaby Kincaid, and she saw that he was not smiling. He only nodded once. "Good," he said. "Now do it again. 20 more times, then 100 more times, and then 100 more after that until your hands know how without your mind having to ask." She reloaded. She fired. She reloaded. She fired. The afternoon wore on and the sun moved across the sky, and the muscles in her shoulders began to ache and then to burn, and still she kept shooting. While she reloaded, Barnaby spoke. He spoke of his brother Gideon. He told her how he had taught Gideon to shoot in the backfield of their farm in Kentucky when Gideon had been 12 years old, and Barney himself had been only 19, and the two of them had been all the family each other had. He told her how Gideon had become a better shot than his older brother by the time he was 15. He told her how when the war came, he had thought he could keep Gideon safe by keeping him close. He told her how that had not been the way of it. How a shell fragment at Shiloh had taken Gideon across the chest. How Gideon's last words had been an apology. "He told me he was sorry, Mrs. Ashworth, my little brother. He told me he was sorry he was not strong enough to hold on. He apologized to me for being killed, and I have carried that apology in my pocket every day for 17 years. Cordelia lowered the Winchester. She turned and looked up at the giant standing beside her in the slanting afternoon light, at the freckled face above the copper beard, at the bright blue eyes that were now wet at the corner but not yet weeping. "Barnaby," she said, "you did not fail him. You loved him enough that he died loved. That is the only thing any of us can give the people we are afraid to lose." The big man closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again, he laid one enormous scarred hand very lightly on the top of her head, the way a father might bless a daughter. And then he stepped back and pointed at the corral fence. Pick up the rifle, ma'am. 20 more shots. Because if Crowhurst comes for you when I am not standing beside you, I want to know that you can put him in the ground yourself. By the time the sun touched the western peaks, Cordelia Ashworth had hit the bottles 18 times out of 20. Her shoulder was a deep purple bruise beneath her shirt that she would not show anyone, and her ears were ringing from the gunfire, and she had not felt so alive since the night before her husband died. It was that same night, late after the others had gone to bed, that Silas Thornberry told her about Shiloh. She had come down for a glass of water from the kitchen pump and had found him sitting in front of the dying embers of the hearth fire, cleaning the cylinder of his Colt by the light of a single oil lamp. He looked up when she came in. He did not seem surprised to see her. He gestured at the chair across from his. She sat. She waited. She had learned in the days she had been at Whispering Pines that Silas Thornberry was a man who began to speak only when he was ready, and that the wise thing was not to hurry him. After a long while, he laid down the Colt. Mrs. Ashworth, he said, I told you the truth about Shiloh on your first night here. I told you the version a man tells in front of company. Tonight I want to tell you the rest. She did not speak. She just waited. He told her. He told her how the order had come down at first light, how he had ridden up to Colonel Peabody's tent with the reins still on his shoulders, and asked the colonel to reconsider how he had used the word folly, and how the colonel had used the word coward in return. He told her how he had ridden back to his men, and how every face in those 200 had looked up at him with the trust of soldiers who believe their captain knows what he is doing. He told her how he had given the order to advance, and how Gideon Kincaid, 17 years old and bright, with the kind of foolish courage that only 17-year-olds have had, stepped forward and asked to carry the company colors. He told her how he had nodded yes to that, and how he had spent every night of the 17 years since regretting that nod. He told her about the cannon. He told her about the hot iron whisper of canister shot moving through wheat. He told her how he had seen Gideon fall, and how he had spurred his horse forward to reach the boy, and how Barnaby had reached him first, how he had watched the giant scoop up his small dying brother and carry him back down through the smoke. He told her how he had ridden into the surgeon's tent behind a stand of oak trees and found Dr. Absalom Whitfield with his arms red to the elbows, and 3 Union soldiers laid out on plank tables with no morphine left in any bottle in the camp. He told her how the man on the first table had been a farmer from Lancaster County named Joshua Reed, who had 2 daughters at home, and how Dr. Whitfield had cut Joshua Reed's leg off below the knee with a wood saw, while Joshua Reed bit down on a leather strap and stared at the canvas roof of the tent and prayed out loud to a God who did not seem to be listening. He told her how Joshua Reed had died on that table from shock before the bandage could even be tied. He told her how the second man had died the same way, and the third. I survived Shiloh, Mrs. Ashworth, Silas said, but I have wondered every day since then whether the part of me that mattered survived it with me. I went on through Antietam and Fredericksburg and Gettysburg. I commanded men until the last day of the war, and every order I gave with the faces of those 79 men sitting in the back of my mind. At Appomattox, when General Lee rode out to surrender the men around me, wept. I did not weep. I just stood in the mud and felt nothing at all. I thought, well, Silas, now you can rest. And then I realized I did not know what resting was supposed to feel like. I had forgotten. He looked across the lamp at Cordelia. I have been trying to remember for 17 years, Mrs. Ashworth, and I have not been able to. Until you came up the road from Red Creek with a crate of chickens in the eyes of a woman who had buried her husband and her child in the same season, and I saw in your face something that I had once seen in my own mirror, and for the first time in a very long time I did not feel alone in the country I have been walking through. Cordelia did not speak for a long moment. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind moved through the pines and made its low whisper. When she did speak, her voice was very quiet. Silas, I want to tell you something about Teddy. The night before he died, he sat with me on the porch of our cabin in Wyoming. The stars were out. He was holding my hand. He said to me, Cordelia, sometimes I think about a captain I pulled out from under his horse at Antietam. I never knew his name. I never saw him again. But I think about him sometimes, and I hope that he is at peace because I figure if I saved him, then at least I did one good thing in this world. Silas Thornberry's hand, the hand with the missing joint, went very still on the table. He said that to you. He said that to me, and I did not understand it then. I did understand that he meant something by it. Tonight I understand. He saved you so that one day you would be here to save me. He knew. Some part of him knew. Silas Thornberry looked down at his maimed hand. He turned it over slowly in the lamplight. Then he lifted his eyes back to her. Mrs. Ashworth, may I touch your hand? She reached across the table and laid her hand in his. He held it. That was all. He did not raise it, did not press it to his lips, did not say a word more. He simply held the hand of the woman whose husband had once dragged him out of fire. And they sat that way in the quiet of the log house at Whispering Pines, while the fire burned itself down to a bed of soft red coals, and the night moved slowly past outside the window. When she finally rose to go back to her room, neither of them said goodnight. They did not need to. On the morning of the 11th day, Cordelia rode out with Dr. Absalom Whitfield to see his small house at the eastern edge of the property. It was a clear, cool morning. The sky over Montana that day was the color of a flag washed in cold water. The doctor wanted her help with something practical. His medical supplies had come in on a freight wagon from Bismarck the week before, and many of the bottles were labeled in Latin abbreviations he could read but could not always remember at speed. And he wanted her to make him a fair handwritten list in English, organized by use, so that in an emergency he would not have to hunt. His house was a small log cabin set back among the pines a mile east of the main ranch buildings. It had one large room and a small back chamber. The large room held a writing desk, a bed neatly made with a wool blanket, two chairs, a small iron stove, and bookshelves that ran from floor to ceiling along three of the walls. There were more books in that one cabin than Cordelia had seen since Boston. Marcus Aurelius, Walt Whitman, Shakespeare, a worn medical text in Latin, volumes of Dickens and of Plutarch, and on the writing desk in a brass frame the daguerreotype of the young woman with the soft mouth. Cordelia saw the picture and did not ask. She had learned that much. But Dr. Whitfield saw her see it. He was a man who had spent 14 years not speaking of certain things, and on that particular morning in the quiet of his own house, with a young woman sitting at his table who had lost her own beloved, he found that he wanted to. Her name was Eleanor Pembroke, he said. I met her in Philadelphia in the year 1859. I was a medical student. She was a teacher who held classes in the back rooms of churches for children whose parents could not afford schooling. We met at a Quaker meeting house. We fell in love over the course of one winter. In June of 1860, we were married in secret by a minister who was willing to risk what most ministers were not willing to risk. The laws of Pennsylvania at that time did not permit a marriage between a colored man and a white woman. We had hopes of moving to Canada when I finished my training. He paused. He took off his spectacles and began to clean them on a white handkerchief, the way he always did when something was difficult. The war began in April of 1861. I volunteered as a surgeon's assistant within the week. Eleanor stayed in Philadelphia. We wrote to each other every week for 2 years. Then her letters stopped coming. I wrote 3 more times. Nothing came back. He set the spectacles down on the table. In March of 1864, I was given 5 days of leave. I rode straight to Philadelphia. I went first to the boarding house where she had been living. The landlady would not look me in the face. She handed me an address for the Pembroke family home, which I had never been allowed to visit. I rode there. The butler told me through a half-open door that Miss Eleanor had passed away in January of the previous year. He said she had taken a fever and had died in 3 days. He said the family had buried her at Laurel Hill Cemetery. He shut the door before I could ask another question. I rode to Laurel Hill. I found her grave. There was no name on the stone, only the dates. Her family did not put her name on the marker because they did not want her remembered as the wife of a colored man. They had hidden her death from me for over a year so that I could not come and stand at her funeral. His voice did not break, it only went quieter. I went back to the regiment. I served out the war. When the war was over, Silas and Barney and I made our promise and we came west. I have not been back to Philadelphia since. Cordelia did not say she was sorry. She knew by then that I am sorry was not what a man like Dr. Absalom Whitfield needed to hear. Instead, she reached out and touched the brass frame on the desk very gently, the way you touch the hand of a friend at a wake. She had a kind face, Absalom. She did, Mrs. Ashworth, the kindest I ever saw. He picked up his spectacles again and put them on. He looked at her over the lenses. There is something I want to say to you, Cordelia. I have learned one thing from losing Eleanor that I will give to you for free. Do not wait. If there is something true that you need to say to Silas Thornberry, say it before the day comes when you cannot. We are men who have learned how to wait. You do not have to learn that lesson from us. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded. Thank you, Doctor. I will remember. That night a storm came down out of the Bitterroots. It came fast and from the northwest, the way the bad September storms always came, with a sky that turned green at the edges and a wind that pulled the heads of the pines sideways and a low rolling thunder that walked on the high country before it walked on the valley. Cordelia woke in the middle of the night to the sound of it. Rain hammered against the glass of her window. Lightning lit the room blue for an instant and then left it darker than before. And under the smell of wet pine and cold rain, she smelled smoke. She was out of bed and into her boots before she had finished thinking. She caught up the shawl from the bedpost and threw open her door and ran down the hall in her nightdress. And as she came into the main room, she saw through the front window a glow in the wrong place. A glow out behind the barn where there should have been only darkness, and she understood instantly what she was seeing. The forge was on fire. She screamed Barnaby's name through the house. Doors banged open. Silas was coming down the stairs, already with his Winchester in his hand and his boots half laced. Barnaby came pounding out of his own room without a shirt on his copper hair, wild, his blue eyes wide. My forge, Barnaby said. Just the two words, and then he was past her and out the front door into the rain. Cordelia ran after him. Silas ran beside her. Behind them came Absalom from the room where he had been spending the night because of the storm. The forge was already burning hard despite the rain. Someone had poured kerosene around the foundation and had set it alight in 3 places at once, and the wood of the building had caught with the speed only kerosene can give. The roof was a sheet of orange. Smoke rolled black against the lightning. Barnaby Kincaid did not slow down. He ran straight at the burning building. Cordelia shouted his name and tried to grab his arm and missed. He threw open the door of the forge and plunged in. She knew even before she made the choice that she was going in after him. She did not let herself think about it. She wrapped the wet shawl over her head and shoulders and ducked through the door behind him. The inside of the forge was a roar of heat and smoke. The anvil stood black and solid in the middle of the floor. The walls were sheets of flame. Barnaby was at the back wall where his tools hung on iron hooks, and he was reaching up to lift down a great hammer with a worn hickory handle. The hammer of his father, the hammer he had carried out of Kentucky in 1865. Cordelia grabbed the back of his arm and shouted into his ear, "Barney, the roof is going to come down. Now, now." He turned with the hammer in his hand, and in that instant, a beam at the back of the forge cracked and dropped a sheet of burning roof down behind him, and Cordelia pulled him by the arm, and they ran together for the door. They came out into the rain just as the front section of the roof gave way behind them with a great groaning crash, and a fountain of sparks rolling up into the wet sky. Out in the open, Silas was firing into the dark. He had seen a figure running away through the grass on the far side of the burning forge, and he had put 2 shots after it. The figure had gone down. Silas did not lower the rifle until he was sure it was not going to get up again. Dr. Whitfield reached Barnaby's side. The big man was standing in the rain holding his father's hammer in one hand and staring at the burning ruin of the building his father had taught him to build. The skin of his right hand and forearm was scorched and blistering where the heat had gotten to him through the wet shawl. He did not seem to notice. "Come inside, Barney," Dr. Whitfield said quietly. "Inside the house, now, for that hand makes you sicker than the burn." Barnaby Kincaid did not move. He looked at Cordelia. "Mrs. Ashworth, you came in after me." "I did. You should not have done that." "I am not going to argue with you about it, Barnaby. Walk to the house." He walked. Inside the main house by the light of the oil lamps, Dr. Whitfield treated the burns on Barnaby's hand and arm with the steady, careful hands of a man who had once cut legs off in a tent at Shiloh. Cordelia held the basin of water and passed the strips of clean linen. Silas stood at the window with his Winchester across his chest, watching the dark. When the bandage was tied, Barnaby looked at the pile of soot and ash his palm had left on the kitchen table beside the hammer and said very softly, "That forge was my father's. He built it with his own hands in Kentucky in 1845. When the partisans burned our farm during the war, that hammer was the only thing I could carry away. I built the forge here at Whispering Pines in 1865, exactly the way he had built his, and tonight it has burned a second time." Cordelia knelt beside the chair where the giant was sitting. She took his uninjured hand in both of hers. "Barnaby, your forge is not in that burned building. Your forge is in your two hands, and we will build it again, together." He looked at her. He nodded slowly. Silas turned away from the window and walked over to a small object lying on the kitchen table. He had brought it in from outside. It was a piece of metal. He picked it up and held it out so the others could see it. It was a small brass pin shaped like a raven with its wings spread. It had been ripped from the coat of the man Silas had shot. "Crowhurst has made his first move," Silas said. "Tomorrow we make ours. We are not waiting 2 weeks anymore." 2 days after the fire, Cordelia rode into Red Creek with Silas and Dr. Whitfield. She needed bandages and clean lint and a fresh tin of the salve Dr. Whitfield was using on Barney's burns, and the supplies at the ranch were nearly used up. They went together because none of them was willing to let her ride alone. They came into Red Creek in the middle of the morning. The town was quiet. The dust on the street was settled. They tied their horses in front of Jacobson's Mercantile, and Dr. Whitfield went off to see a farmer at the south end of town whose wife had sent word 2 days earlier that her husband had broken his leg falling off a hay wagon. Silas walked Cordelia inside the store and watched her begin to gather what she needed, and then a thin, barefoot boy of perhaps 10 years came running into the store from the street. "Mr. Thornberry, Mr. Thornberry, there is a man at the end of the street, says he has news of Crowhurst, says you are to come quick." Silas looked down at the boy. He looked at Cordelia. He looked at Hetty Blackwell, who had come into the store 5 minutes earlier and was now sitting in her usual chair by the cold stove with her shotgun across her knees. "Hetty," Silas said, "watch her, 5 minutes." "I will, Silas. Go." He went. It was a mistake. He understood it before he had taken 20 steps down the street. The boy was running too fast and not looking back. The street was too empty for the middle of a morning. The doors of the saloon and the feed store were standing open in a way that did not feel right. Silas Thornberry, who had walked many picket lines in his life, recognized the silence around him for what it was, and he turned on his heel and started back toward Jacobson's at a dead run. He was not fast enough. Inside the Mercantile, the back door of the storeroom opened, and 3 men slipped through it. Cordelia was at the shelf at the rear of the store reaching for a roll of clean linen. She heard the back door. She heard the soft clink of a man's spur catching on the threshold. Some part of her brain that had been built over the past 6 months, the part of her that had been forged in a Wyoming farmhouse on a February night, took over before her thinking part could catch up. She dropped the roll of linen and dropped to a crouch behind the long pine counter, and drew the small Colt pocket revolver Silas had given her on her 5th night at the ranch, which she had carried in the pocket of her work skirt every day since. The first man came around the end of the counter with a knife in his hand. He had time to see her and to look surprised. She shot him in the right shoulder. He went down hard against the barrels of flour and stayed there. The second man was already raising a pistol. From her chair by the cold stove, Hetty Blackwell, 70 years old and 4 feet 11 inches tall, swung up the double-barrel shotgun that she had kept beneath her apron for 30 years and put a load of buckshot into his chest. He went over backward with a sound like a sack of wet grain hitting the floor. The third man was at the back door, half in and half out, when Cordelia put her second bullet through the meat of his right thigh. He screamed and fell sideways into the storeroom and started to crawl back the way he had come. Silas Thornberry came through the front door of Jacobson's Mercantile with his Colt drawn and his eyes wild and stopped dead in the middle of the floor. The first man was groaning behind the flour barrels. Barrels. The second man was not making any sound at all. The third man was crawling away into the storeroom and leaving a wide red trail behind him on the planks. Hetty Blackwell was calmly breaking open her shotgun to reload, and Cordelia Ashworth was standing up slowly behind the counter with the pocket Colt still in her hand and her dark eyes fixed on Silas's face. There was a long moment in which nobody in the room said anything at all. Then Silas Thornberry crossed the floor in 3 strides and laid one hand against the side of Cordelia's face very lightly just for an instant, and then took it away again. "Mrs. Ashworth, are you hurt?" "I am not hurt, Captain, but we cannot wait any longer. He has come for me in broad daylight in the middle of a town. There is nothing left to wait for." "I know," Silas said. "Tonight we make the plan. Tomorrow night we move." But Octavius Crowhurst was not going to give them tomorrow night either. The next morning, while the smell of black powder was still in Cordelia's nostrils, and the buried man from Jacobson's storeroom was still being measured for a pine box at the back of the undertaker's shop, Silas Thornberry and a long-time hired hand named Tobias Garrick rode out to check the cattle at the northern boundary of Whispering Pines. It was a routine ride. They had made it 100 times. Silas wanted to see with his own eyes that the herd had not been scattered or driven off in the night. In a narrow draw a mile from the boundary fence, 6 men were waiting in the rocks above the trail. The first volley killed Tobias Garrick instantly. He took a bullet through the chest and another through the throat and went off his horse without making a sound. Silas was hit twice in the same instant, once high in the left shoulder and once through the meat of the right thigh, and his horse spun and threw him hard into the brush at the side of the trail. He should have died there. Any other man would have died there. Silas Thornberry, captain of the 28th Pennsylvania Volunteer Cavalry, played dead. He lay on his side in the brush with his eyes half closed and his Colt drawn against his belly, under his coat, and waited. The men in the rocks above came down slowly to be sure of their work. He let them come close. He let the first man kneel beside Tobias and turn the body over with the toe of his boot. He let the second man come up beside him to do the same. And then when both men were within 5 feet of him, Silas Thornberry rolled half onto his back and shot them both at point-blank range with the Colt held flat against his side. The other 4 turned and ran for their horses, and Silas put one more shot after them and missed, and then his vision went gray at the edges, and he could not raise the pistol any further. He lay in the brush with the blood from his shoulder and his thigh seeping into the dust and listened to the hoofbeats of the 4 survivors fade away into the distance. Then he got up. He could not remember afterward how he had gotten up. He only remembered that there had been no other choice. He could not lie down and die in that draw because there was a woman waiting for him at Whispering Pines who needed him to come back. So he got up, he made it onto his feet, he fell, he got up again, he started to walk. He walked with his good hand pressed against his thigh to slow the bleeding and his shoulder hanging crooked, and his vision going in and out of darkness, and somewhere along the way, his horse, an old gelding named Vesper that he had ridden since the year the war ended, came back to him at a slow, careful walk, and stood beside him until he could pull himself up into the saddle. He did not remember how he got into the saddle either. He only remembered that Vesper carried him. Vesper carried him most of the way home. Then Vesper, with the saddle slick with blood and the man on his back going slack, broke into a trot and then a canter and went on the last mile alone, because that was what an old cavalry horse did when his rider had fallen too far down inside himself to give the orders anymore. The horse came into the home pasture of Whispering Pines just before noon with an empty saddle wet with blood. Cordelia Ashworth saw the horse from the kitchen window. She did not scream. She did not call out. She set down the bowl of bread dough she had been working and walked outside and took the reins of Vesper in her hands and looked at the empty stirrups and the dark stain down the saddle skirt. And then she turned and walked very fast to the barn where Barnaby Kincaid was working one-handed at the temporary anvil he had set up. "Barney, Vesper has come back without him." Barnaby Kincaid looked up from his work. He looked at her face. He set down the tongs. "Saddle the bay mare," he said. "Saddle one for me, too. We are going." They rode out together. Barnaby's right hand was still half wrapped in the bandage from the forge fire, and he could not handle a rifle properly with it, but he carried his with the left hand, and he set his jaw, and he did not complain. Cordelia rode beside him with her own Winchester, the one Barney had taught her on in a saddle scabbard, at her knee. They found Silas 2 hours later. He had made it almost to a little stand of cottonwoods on the bank of the creek that ran through the north pasture before he had fallen out of the saddle for the last time. He was lying on his back in the grass, with his face the color of old paper and his shoulders soaked through and his right trouser leg dark to the knee. His eyes were closed. For one terrible second, Cordelia thought he was dead. Then his lips moved. "Mrs. Ashworth," he said. The words were so soft they were almost not words. "Mrs. Ashworth, I am sorry. I was not careful enough." "Quiet, Silas. Be quiet now. We are taking you home." Barnaby Kincaid lifted Silas Thornberry in his arms, as if Silas weighed no more than a child, and laid him across the saddle of the bay mare, and led the mare back toward Whispering Pines at the gentlest walk a horse can be made to walk. Cordelia rode beside them with her hand on Silas's good shoulder, and she did not take her hand away for the entire ride home. Dr. Absalom Whitfield was waiting on the porch when they came in. He had been alerted by a rider Cordelia had sent ahead. His sleeves were already rolled to the elbow, and his medical bag was open on the porch table, and a kettle of water was already boiling on the kitchen stove. The surgery took 5 hours. Dr. Whitfield worked at the long plank table in the main room of the house. Cordelia stood at his right hand. She held the lantern. She passed the instruments. She gripped Silas's good hand when the probing of the wound made him jerk under the laudanum, and she did not flinch, and she did not weep, and she did not look away. She had learned at the bottom of a Wyoming winter that flinching was a luxury a woman in her position could not afford. The bullet in the shoulder had passed through and out the back. The bullet in the thigh had lodged against the bone and had to be cut out with a scalpel and a probe. Dr. Whitfield worked the way he had once worked at Shiloh, slow and careful and silent, and at the end of the 5th hour, he straightened his back and set down the instruments and looked across the table at Cordelia Ashworth and said one word: "Living." Then he sat down hard in the chair beside the hearth and put his face in his hands. That night, very late, Cordelia sat alone beside the bed where Silas Thornberry was sleeping under the heavy weight of the laudanum. The oil lamp on the bedside table was turned down low. The wind was moving through the pines outside the window with its whispering sound. She had taken his good hand in both of hers and was holding it loosely against her cheek. He stirred. His eyelids opened. In the lamplight, his green eyes were clouded, but they were focused on her. "Cordelia," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name without the title in front of it. "Silas, you are awake. Do not try to move. You will tear the stitches." "Cordelia, I need to say this now in case I do not get another chance to say it. I know you still love Theodore Ashworth. I know I have no right to ask for what I am about to ask for. But Dr. Whitfield told me once that the worst thing he ever learned from losing Eleanor was that he had waited too long to say what was true. So I am not going to wait. I have spent 17 years in this country looking for a reason to be a man again, instead of a survivor. I found the reason on the day you came up the road from Red Creek with a crate of chickens in your hands. I am not asking you to love me. Not now, not yet, maybe not ever. But if we live through what is coming, I want you to know that Whispering Pines is your home for as long as you want it. And if a day comes when you are ready, I would like to be the man who walks beside you. Not in place of Theodore, beside him, beside his memory. That is what I am asking. That is all. Cordelia Ashworth looked down at the man on the bed, the captain who had been pulled out from under a dead horse at Antietam by the lieutenant she had loved. The man whose missing finger joint she had felt for the first time on the wagon ride out from Red Creek. The man who had bled into the dust of his own pasture rather than go down without coming home to her. She lifted his hand from her cheek and pressed her lips very softly to the back of it, and then she leaned forward and pressed her forehead against his. Silas Thornberry, she said, you live through Octavius Crowhurst. You live and you come back to me whole, and then we will speak of tomorrow. His eyes closed. A long, slow breath went out of him. It was not a dying breath. It was the breath of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had at last been told he could set it down. Outside the closed door of the bedroom, Barnaby Kincaid had been standing in the dim hallway with his bandaged hand at his side and his head bowed forward, and he had heard every word. He did not feel ashamed of having heard. He turned and went quietly down the stairs to where Dr. Absalom Whitfield was sitting by the dying hearth fire with his book closed on his knee. Absalom show, Barnaby said. Silas has finally found the road home. Dr. Whitfield set the book aside and looked up at the giant who had been his friend for 17 years. Then it is on us, Barney, to make sure he lives long enough to walk it. Tomorrow we begin to plan in earnest. The day after we ride for Octavius Crowhurst. The day after, Barnaby agreed. Outside the house, the wind moved through the pines above Whispering Pines with the same low whispering sound it had made on every night since Silas Thornberry had first heard it in the spring of 1865. But tonight, for the first time in 14 long years, that whisper sounded less like a secret being told to the dead and more like a name being spoken into the future. The name was Cordelia. For 3 days after the surgery, Silas Thornberry slept the deep sleep of a man whose body was deciding whether to come back at all. Cordelia Ashworth did not leave his side. She moved a chair into the bedroom, and she sat in it through the long hours of the day, and she dragged a folded quilt to the floor beside the bed at night and slept in snatches there, with one hand resting against the edge of his blanket so that she would feel him stir if he stirred. Dr. Absalom Whitfield came in every 2 hours to check the bandages and to put a damp cloth to Silas's forehead when the fever rose, and Barnaby Kincaid came in every 4 hours and stood at the foot of the bed for one long silent minute and then went back out to the porch where his Winchester was leaning against the rail. On the morning of the 4th day, Silas opened his eyes and asked for water in a voice that was almost his own. By the morning of the 7th day, he was sitting up against the bolster pillows. By the morning of the 10th day, against every order Dr. Whitfield had given him, he was on his feet. He came down the stairs of the log house, slowly leaning hard on a cane Barnaby had cut and shaped for him from a length of seasoned ash. His left arm was still in a sling. His right thigh was bound tight beneath his trousers and would be bound tight for a long time to come. But his green eyes were clear, and there was iron back in his jaw, and when he stepped down off the last stair into the main room of the house, the 3 people who had been waiting for him stood up at the long plank table without a word. Cordelia, Barnaby, Absalom, Silas Thornberry walked a few steps to the table on his cane. He lowered himself into his chair at the head of it. He looked at each of them in turn, and then he laid his good hand flat on the wood. "It is time," he said. Cordelia had already spread her father's leather journal open on the table. Inside its pages, drawn carefully in pencil over the past 2 weeks, was the most detailed map of the Crowhurst Cattle Company holdings that anyone outside of Octavius Crowhurst's own household had ever made. She had drawn it from things she had heard in Jacobson's Mercantile and from things Hetty Blackwell had told her in the back room of the boarding house and from things Barnaby had remembered from his own scouting rides in the months before her arrival. She had marked the main ranch house, the bunkhouses, the corrals, the position of every line shack she could account for. And in the eastern pasture of the Crowhurst spread, she had marked one particular trail with a small circle in red ink. She turned the journal so the men could see. "This trail," she said, "this is where he rides every Saturday morning. He goes out alone except for 2 bodyguards to look at the cattle in his eastern pasture. He has been doing it for 6 years. He believes nobody knows it. He is wrong." Silas studied the map for a long moment. He looked up at her. "How did you come by this?" Hetty's nephew worked at one season as a wrangler for Crowhurst before he was fired for being too honest. He told her. She told me 3 days ago when I went to her with the bandages." Silas almost smiled. "Mrs. Ashworth, I am beginning to think that Octavius Crowhurst made the worst mistake of his life when he sent men to a Wyoming farmhouse on a winter night 6 months ago." "He did," Cordelia said quietly. "He just does not know it yet." Silas pulled the journal toward him. He looked at the trail. He looked at the small ridge to the south of the trail and the line of rocks to the north. He was a man who had read terrain like other men read newspapers since he was 22 years old, and his eyes saw at once what could be done. "This is the place," he said. "Saturday morning, 3 days from now. We will be in those rocks before first light. Barney on the south side of the trail behind the big boulder I see marked here. Absalom on the north side in the cottonwoods. I will be in the middle of the trail in the open. When Crowhurst comes around the bend, he will see one man standing in his way. By the time he understands what is happening, his 2 bodyguards will already be down." He paused. He looked at Cordelia. "And you will be on the high ground 300 yards back with Barney's Winchester. You are the best long shot we have made this month, ma'am, including Barney. If anything goes sideways, if any of his men try to break out of the trap, you take them out from above. That is your post. You do not leave it for any reason. Do you understand me?" "Silas, I need to be down there. He killed Teddy. I need to be the one who looks him in the eye when the law puts the cuffs on him. Cordelia, I am telling you this as the captain of this engagement, and I am telling you this as the man who is in love with you. If I have to spend the morning of that engagement worrying about whether you are alive in the brush at the side of the trail, I will not be able to do my job. If you are on the ridge, I know you are safe, and I know you are watching over us. That is the difference between a captain who cannot think and a captain who can. Will you give me that?" She did not answer him for a long moment. Then she nodded once. "I will give you that, Silas Thornberry. But when it is over, when he was on the ground, you will bring me to him. I want him to see my face. I want him to know who finished him. That is my condition." "That is granted, ma'am." Barnaby Kincaid leaned forward over the table. The bandage on his right hand had been changed that morning, and the burn beneath it was starting to heal. He held the hand out flat and flexed the fingers slowly. "I can hold a rifle, Captain. Not as well as I would like, but well enough at the range you are talking about. I will not miss the bodyguard on my side. I know you will not, Barney." Dr. Absalom Whitfield set his spectacles on the table and rubbed at his eyes for a moment. When he looked up, his face was set the way Cordelia had once imagined it must have looked in a surgeon's tent in Tennessee. "I have not fired a rifle in earnest since 1865, Silas. I want you to know that before we go in. But I have been a good shot in my life, and the man on my side of the trail will not get past me. You have my word on it." "I have always had your word, Absalom. That is why we are still alive." Silas leaned back in his chair. His good hand went up and pinched the bridge of his nose, the way it always did when he was about to say something he had not yet said. There is one more thing. We are not killing Octavius Crowhurst. We are taking him alive, and we are putting him on a horse, and we are riding him into Bismarck and handing him to United States Marshal Burke. I have already sent word ahead to Burke through a courier I trust. He is expecting us. If we kill Crowhurst at the trap, we are murderers, and the Crowhurst Cattle Company lawyers will hang the four of us at Whispering Pines from the same gallows. If we take Crowhurst alive, we are citizens making a lawful arrest of a man wanted for the murder of Theodore Ashworth and three other ranchers, and we walk out of this thing with our names on the right side of the line. Are we agreed? Three voices answered him at the same time. Agreed. Silas looked once more at each of them. His captain's eyes lingered the longest on Cordelia. Then we ride at 3 hours before sunrise on Saturday. That was Wednesday afternoon. They had 2.5 days to get ready. In those 2.5 days, Whispering Pines became something it had not been since the war. It became a camp. Barnaby went out to his temporary forge in the half-wreckage of the old building and worked one-handed at the anvil to make extra ball ammunition for the Winchesters. Dr. Whitfield Markey laid out his medical bag with the precision of a surgeon expecting casualties, then doubled the supplies and laid out a second bag and gave it to Cordelia to carry on her saddle. Silas, against the wishes of every other person in the house, walked the home pasture twice a day on his cane to get his strength back into his legs. Cordelia did the cooking and the praying and the cleaning of the rifles. And on Friday afternoon, she went out to the chicken coop and stood for a long time looking at the 6 Rhode Island Reds, scratching in the run, and she thought about the night she had carried them in their wooden crate down off the stagecoach in Red Creek. And she thought about how far she had traveled in 3 short months. And she thought about what would happen to the hens if she did not come home from a Saturday morning trail in a Crowhurst pasture. Then she went back into the house and finished cleaning her rifle. On Friday evening, the 4 of them sat down to supper together in the lamp-lit main room of the log house. Cordelia had cooked for hours. There was a roast of beef on the platter and fresh bread and butter from a churn she had operated herself, in a pot of stewed greens from the garden, in a small bowl of dried apples she had been saving for something. Silas had brought up from somewhere a dust-covered bottle of Tennessee whiskey he had been holding in reserve since 1867. He poured 4 glasses. He poured one of them small for Cordelia, who had not asked for any and would not refuse a gesture. "Gentlemen," Silas said, "Mrs. Ashworth, there are things that should be said before a fight in case the fight does not go the way we hope. I have been a soldier long enough to know that. I will not waste our time trying to be clever about it. I will only say what is true." He looked at Dr. Whitfield first. "Absalom, 14 years ago you sat with me in a Virginia field in the rain, and you swore you would come west with me, even though there was no good reason in the world for you to. You have been the wisest man I have ever known, and the steadiest friend a man could ask for. I have never said thank you because I did not think you needed to hear it. Tonight I am saying it, thank you." Dr. Whitfield set down his fork. He was a man who did not weep easily, but his eyes had gone bright behind his spectacles. He nodded once. He did not trust himself to speak. Silas turned his head to Barnaby. "Barney, you picked your brother up off a hillside at Shiloh, and you carried him through fire to a surgeon's tent. I watched you do it, and there has not been a day since when I have not measured myself against the kind of man you are, and there has not been a day when I have come up to your standard. You are a better man than I am. You always have been. I am proud beyond words to ride out tomorrow at your side." Barnaby Kincaid put his giant hand up over his face for a moment. When he took it down, his blue eyes were wet, but his bearded mouth was smiling. "Captain, now you are going to make me cry into my supper, and a man my size crying into his supper is a sad thing for everybody." There was a small, soft laugh around the table, the kind of laugh that comes only when grief and love are sitting at the same plate. Silas turned at last to Cordelia. He looked at her for a long time. She held his gaze. "Cordelia Ashworth, you came up the road from Red Creek in August with a wooden crate in your hands, and the look of a woman who had nothing left in the world. I want you to know that you came up that road bringing more than you understood. You brought us a reason to be men again. You brought your father's mind and your mother's courage and your husband's honor all wrapped together in one woman, and you laid it down on this table without asking anything in return. If I do not come back from tomorrow morning, I want you to know that the last 3 months have been the only months in 17 years that have felt like life to me. I do not have words for what that is worth. I only have the words thank you. So I am saying them now, thank you. Cordelia did not answer in words. She lifted her glass of whiskey instead. To 3 broken men who are not broken anymore, she said. To Theodore Ashworth, who pulled a captain out from under a horse at Antietam and never knew where it would lead. And to Whispering Pines. They drank. The whiskey was hot and old and good. Dr. Whitfield raised his glass next. To Eleanor Pembroke, who I loved, who died alone in Philadelphia while I was away at war, and who would have liked very much to have met all of you. Barnaby raised his glass after him. To Gideon Kincaid, who carried the colors up a hill in Tennessee at 17 years old because nobody else's brother should have to. I am still your brother boy. Save me a seat at the table on the other side. And Silas raised his glass last. To family. To the family we have lost, and to the family we have chosen, and to the family that is sitting in this room tonight. To Whispering Pines. And to tomorrow. They drank again. They finished the supper. They cleared the dishes together, all 4 of them, the way a family clears a table. That night, very late, when the house had gone quiet and the lamps had been put out, Cordelia walked alone in her nightdress and shawl down the upstairs hall to the door of Silas Thornberry's room. She stood with her hand raised in the air to knock, and she did not knock. She lowered her hand. She turned and went back to her own room. Some things she had decided long since on a stagecoach out of Cheyenne were better kept for the morning after a thing instead of the night before it. But she stood for a long time at her window before she lay down. She watched the bitter roots black against the stars. She thought about the man down the hall who had asked her by his bedside to walk beside him in some future she could not yet quite see. She thought about Theodore Ashworth, who was buried in a Wyoming graveyard with no one to tend his stone. She thought about how strange it was that the heart of a woman could hold 2 whole loves at once without one diminishing the other. Then she lay down and slept until Barnaby Kincaid knocked softly on her door 3 hours before the dawn. They rode out under stars. 4 horses, 4 riders, no lanterns, no talk. Silas led on Vesper, sitting his saddle, stiff and careful because of the bandages, but sitting it nonetheless. Barnaby came next, his great red beard pulled inside the collar of a heavy coat against the cold. Dr. Whitfield came after with both medical bags strapped behind his cantle. Cordelia rode last on the bay mare Barnaby had taught her to handle with Barnaby's Winchester in the long scabbard at her knee. They crossed the home pasture at a walk. They picked up a trail through the foothills that ran south by southeast and would bring them by sunrise to the backside of the ridge that overlooked Crowhurst's eastern pasture. The ground was hard with the first true frost of the autumn. The breath of the horses came out in pale plumes. Coyotes called somewhere far off in the dark. They did not speak. There was nothing left to say that had not already been said the night before over whiskey and supper. 2 hours before dawn, they tied their horses in a draw, a quarter-mile back from the ridge. They climbed the last distance on foot. Silas climbed slow, leaning on his cane on one side and on Barnaby's elbow on the other, and never once asked anyone to wait for him. At the top of the ridge, they stopped. Silas pointed down through the gray of the false dawn to the trail that ran along the bottom of a shallow draw. He laid out the positions one last time. Barnaby to the south side of the trail behind the big boulder. Dr. Whitfield to the north in the cottonwoods. Silas himself to walk out into the middle of the trail when the time came. Cordelia to a position 300 yards back, on a small rise where the bunch grass would hide her down to the shoulders, with the Winchester braced across a flat rock. Her eyes would see everything. Her shot would reach anywhere on that trail. Before they parted to take their places, Silas turned to her in the gray light. Cordelia, if this goes badly, you do not come down to help. You ride. You ride hard for Bismarck. You find Marshall Burke. You give him the journal. You tell him everything. Promise me. Silas Thornberry, I am not promising any such thing. I am promising you that I will be at my post and that I will shoot every man who tries to harm you. That is the promise you are getting. Take it or leave it. He looked at her for a long moment in the gray. Then his good hand came up and brushed once very lightly against the side of her face. I will take it. Then he turned and limped down to his place in the middle of the trail. The sun rose at 6 minutes past 6. The light came up over the eastern grasslands, the color of pale honey, and the frost on the bunch grass glittered like spilled salt, and the Bitterroot Mountains in the west turned the pink of an old rose. Cordelia lay flat behind her rock with her cheek against the cold stock of Barnaby's Winchester. Her breath was steady. Her hands were steady. The world had narrowed to the trail below her, and the three figures she could see at their stations in the empty bend in the road from which Octavius Crowhurst was about to come. She heard the hoofbeats first. 3 horses, walking easy, no hurry in them. Then she saw them. Octavius Crowhurst rode at the front in his black coat with the silver raven on the lapel. His blood-colored gloves rested loose on the saddle horn. He was talking low and casual to the 2 men riding a length behind him. He was a man who had ridden this trail every Saturday morning for 6 years and had never once expected anything to be different. He came around the bend. Silas Thornberry stepped out into the middle of the trail. The duster coat hung loose from his shoulders. His hat was pulled low. He did not raise the cane he had leaned on a moment ago in the brush. His good hand rested on the butt of the Colt at his right hip. He did not move and he did not speak until Crowhurst's horse had shied to a stop in front of him at 20 paces. Octavius Crowhurst, Silas said. Stop right there. Crowhurst's mouth opened. The shock on his face was a thing Cordelia could read even from 300 yards. Thornberry, you are alive. I am alive, and I have come to take you in. You stand accused of the murders of Theodore Ashworth of Wyoming, of Tobias Garrick of Whispering Pines, and of 3 other men whose names I will read to you in front of a federal judge. United States Marshal Burke is waiting for you in Bismarck. Step down off your horse. Drop your gun belt in the dust. Put your hands on top of your head. You will not be harmed if you do this now. Crowhurst laughed. It was a thin laugh, but it was a real one, the laugh of a man who has not yet understood that his hand has been beaten. Thornberry, look around you. I have 2 of the best gunmen in Montana at my back. You have nobody. You are a wounded man standing alone in a trail. Step aside. I am not alone, Crowhurst. Crowhurst's 2 bodyguards moved at the same instant. Their right hands dropped toward their pistol butts. Neither of them got the pistols halfway out of leather. From behind the boulder on the south side of the trail, Barnaby Kincaid's Winchester barked once. The bodyguard on the right went out of his saddle as if he had been swept by a hand from the sky. From the cottonwoods on the north side of the trail, Dr. Absalom Whitfield's Winchester barked once. The bodyguard on the left dropped without a sound. Silas Thornberry did not even raise his Colt. For one long second, Octavius Crowhurst sat alone on his horse in the middle of the trail with 2 dead men on the ground beside him and 1 wounded captain standing 20 paces in front of him. His face went the color of something that had been left out in winter. Then he did the thing nobody had expected him to do. He spurred his horse hard and turned its head and broke uphill away from the trail straight up the slope of the rise behind him. He was riding for the high ground. He was riding for the very rise where Cordelia Ashworth was lying flat in the bunch grass. Silas saw it. He knew what was happening before Crowhurst had taken 3 jumps. He shouted her name with everything that was left in his chest. Cordelia. She heard him. She had already heard the shots and seen the bodyguards fall. She was already lifting the cheek piece of the Winchester and bringing the front sight down onto the running horse. She had a choice to make, in the time it takes a heart to beat once. She could shoot Octavius Crowhurst out of the saddle. At 300 yards with the Winchester braced and her breath half let out, and Barnaby Kincaid's instructions written into her muscles by 20 days of practice, she could put the bullet through the center of the chest of the man who had killed her husband and ended the unborn child she had been carrying. She could end him right there, right then, or she could shoot the horse. She thought about Barnaby on the day he had taught her to breathe. She thought about Silas saying the difference between citizens and murderers. She thought about Theodore Ashworth, who had once told her that the only revenge worth taking was the revenge that left a person able to look at themselves in the mirror the next morning. She shot the horse. The Winchester cracked. The bullet took the horse high in the chest at full gallop. The animal went down in a tangle of legs, and Octavius Crowhurst was thrown clear over its head and came down hard on his back in the bunch grass 20 feet from where Cordelia was lying. He landed flat. The wind went out of him in a great gasping cough. His pistol flew from his hand and disappeared somewhere in the grass. He lay on his back with his blood-colored gloves spread out at his sides and his black hat rolling slowly downhill. And for the first time in the whole of his hard, sharp life, Octavius Crowhurst was looking up at a sky he no longer owned. When he was able to breathe again, he turned his head, and he saw her. Cordelia Ashworth was on her feet. She had risen from the bunch grass with the Winchester held loose at her side. Her braid had come half down out of its pinning. The morning light was full on her face. She walked toward him without hurrying, the way a woman walks toward a thing she has been promised by a power older than law. She stopped above him. She set the muzzle of the Winchester against the cold dirt and leaned on it, and she looked down at the man who had ordered the killing of her husband. "Octavius Crowhurst," she said. "My name is Cordelia Ashworth. I am the wife of Theodore Ashworth. You sent men to my home in February. You shot my husband in our front yard. You took a riding crop to my face and you struck me with it, and you laid this scar across my jaw. I was 3 months along with a child. I lost the child that night because of you. You rode away from that house thinking you had finished me. You did not finish me. I am here. I came 2,000 miles to stand above you in the grass." He stared up at her. There was no defiance left in his face. There was only the slow understanding of a man who had at last met somebody he could not buy and could not threaten. "You are going to Bismarck," she said. "You are going to stand in front of a federal judge. You are going to be sentenced for the murders of my husband and of Tobias Garrick and of every man you have killed for the water on his land. And then you are going to be hanged in front of a crowd of the citizens of the territory you tried to swallow. You are not going to here in this grass at my hand. I am not going to give you that. I am not the kind of woman who stains her own hands with the blood of a coward. I am still a human being. That is the difference between you and me." She turned her head and called down the slope, "Barney, bring the rope." By the time Barnaby Kincaid reached the top of the rise with a length of stout hemp from his saddle, Silas Thornberry was limping up the slope behind him with his cane in his good hand and his face white with the cost of the climb, but his eyes burning with something like sunrise. Dr. Whitfield came up after them with his medical bag in case any of the dead were not yet dead. Crowhurst was bound hand and foot and lifted onto a spare horse. The whole engagement, from the moment Crowhurst had ridden around the bend to the moment the rope was tied off, had taken less than 5 minutes. When it was done, Silas Thornberry came to a stop beside Cordelia at the top of the rise. He did not try to embrace her. He only put his good hand very lightly on her shoulder the same way he had touched her cheek that morning in the brush before the fight. She let her own hand come up and rest on top of his. They did not speak. There was nothing in the world that needed to be said. Below them, in the soft golden light of a Montana morning that was beginning the first day of the rest of their lives, Barnaby Kincaid was tying a lead line to the bridle of the horse that carried Octavius Crowhurst, and Dr. Absalom Whitfield was already mounted and waiting, and the wind off the bitterroots was moving through the bunch grass with a sound like a long-held breath being let out at last. They rode for Red Creek by mid-morning. Hetty Blackwell met them on the porch of her boarding house with a shotgun in her hands and a fierce old woman's grin on her face, and she sent her telegraph clerk running to the wire office before they had even tied their horses. By nightfall, United States Marshal Burke and 10 federal deputies were riding hard from Bismarck. They reached Red Creek 2 days later. Marshal Burke was a square-shouldered man with a graying mustache and the eyes of a man who had read too many bad files in his life. And when Cordelia Ashworth handed him her father's leather-bound journal with the evidence written in her own careful hand, he opened it on the desk of Hetty's parlor and read in silence for an hour, and at the end of the hour he looked up and said 3 words. "This is enough." He took Crowhurst into custody. He shook the hand of every man and the hand of the one woman at Whispering Pines. He told Silas that the federal government owed him a debt that the federal government did not know how to pay. Then he and his deputies rode east with Octavius Crowhurst tied and silent on a led horse, and Red Creek watched them go from porches and doorways and second-story windows. And an old woman in a black bonnet stood in the middle of the street and blessed them as they passed, and an entire territory began in that single morning to breathe a little easier. The autumn wore on. The aspens along the creek turned to flame and then to gold, and then dropped their leaves in great drifts that the wind pushed up against the north side of the barn. The cattle were brought in from the high pastures. The first hard frost came in the second week of October. Cordelia spent her days canning the last of the garden vegetables and helping Dr. Whitfield mix winter remedies, and her evenings sitting by the fire, while the 4 of them read aloud to one another and waited for the word from Bismarck. The word came in the second week of November. The trial of Octavius Crowhurst had begun. It lasted 9 days and called 16 witnesses, and at the end of it, the jury was out for less than an hour. Octavius Crowhurst was found guilty of murder in the first degree. He was hanged on a clear, cold December morning in front of a crowd of 300 citizens. Cordelia Ashworth did not go to the hanging. She told Silas that morning quietly over coffee in the kitchen of Whispering Pines that she did not need to see the man die. She only needed to know that justice had been done. The rest, she said, she would leave to God. A week after the hanging, in the second week of December, Silas and Cordelia and Barnaby rode south together for Wyoming. The trip took 8 days each way. They rode through cold weather and one early winter snow that made them camp in a creek bottom for half a day. And at the end of it, they came to a small, overgrown graveyard outside Cheyenne, where Theodore Ashworth lay beneath a wooden marker that had been weathered nearly bare by 6 months of wind. Cordelia knelt beside the grave alone. The 2 men stayed back at a respectful distance. She knelt for a long time. She did not weep. She had wept enough in the kitchen of Whispering Pines on the night they had decided to come for him, and she did not have weeping left for this morning. She only spoke in a voice so soft that the wind almost took the words. "Teddy, I have come to take you home, not to our old home. That home is gone, to a new home, a place called Whispering Pines. There are good men there. One of them is Silas Thornberry. You will remember the name. You saved his life at Antietam. He has been waiting his whole life to pay you back, and the way he is going to pay you back is by taking care of me. I want you to know that I love him. I do not love him in place of you. I love him beside you. The heart is bigger than I knew, Teddy, bigger than anybody ever told me. There is room in mine for both of you, and I will not apologize for that, not to you and not to anybody. You always saw further than I did. I think you knew. I think you sent me to him on purpose. I will love you until the day I die, and I will live, Teddy. I am going to live. That is the promise I am making to you on my knees in this dirt this morning." She rose. She turned. She walked back to where Silas and Barnaby were waiting with the horses, and she nodded to them once. They had brought a long pine box with them made by Barnaby in his temporary forge from the straightest boards Whispering Pines could provide. They opened the grave with care. They laid Theodore Ashworth's remains gently into the box. Barnaby closed the lid and drove the nails himself, slow, one careful blow each. And Cordelia listened to those blows the way a person listens to a hymn. Then they tied the box to the spare horse, and they turned and they rode north. 8 days later, they came home to Whispering Pines. They buried Theodore Ashworth on a clear, cold afternoon beneath the oldest pine tree on the property. Reverend Thomas, the circuit preacher, had come up from Red Creek for the service. Dr. Whitfield read a passage from Ecclesiastes about there being a time for every purpose under heaven. Silas Thornberry, leaning on his cane, gave the eulogy himself. Theodore Ashworth saved my life at Antietam in 1862. I did not know his name then. I did not learn it for 17 years. But not a day went by in those 17 years when I did not feel that I was living on a debt. Today I am paying part of that debt back. Teddy friend, you will rest here under these pines. The wind is going to know your name. We're going to tell your story to our children. And one day on the other side, I will look you in the face and say thank you to you in person. Until then, sleep easy in this ground. You are home. Barnaby Kincaid stepped forward with his father's hammer in his hand. He drove the wooden marker into the earth himself. One blow, two, three. Each blow rang out in the cold December air like the closing of a long sentence. Cordelia laid a small bundle of dried sage on the grave, the last of her father's herbs that she had been carrying in her pocket since Wyoming. Teddy, she whispered, thank you for sending me here. I promise I will live. I promise I will love again. Because that is what you wanted. Silas stood 3 steps behind her hat in his hand, head bowed. He did not move, and he did not speak. He would wait as long as it took. Winter came down hard that year on Whispering Pines. It was a season of healing and quiet. Silas's wounds knit slowly and well under Dr. Whitfield's care. Barnaby's hand finished its mending, and he began to plan the rebuilding of the forge for spring. Cordelia kept the kitchen warm, and the lamps lit, and the bread baking, and on the long evenings, the 4 of them sat by the fire and read aloud and talked of small things, and the wind moved through the pines outside the log walls with its low whispering sound. And for the first time in 14 years, that whispering did not sound like grief. It sounded like a future. The first warm day came in the 2nd week of April of the year 1880. Silas Thornberry walked out to the chicken coop that morning to fetch the eggs. He did this every morning now, partly because he liked to do it, and partly because Cordelia had told him it would be good for the strength of his thigh. He came back into the kitchen with 5 warm brown eggs cradled in his palm. Cordelia was at the stove. He set the eggs in a bowl on the table and looked at her standing there with a wooden spoon in her hand and her hair pinned up off her neck and the morning sun coming in through the window behind her. And he understood that he was not going to wait one more day. Cordelia, he said, walk with me. She set the spoon down. She wiped her hands on her apron. She took her shawl off the peg by the door and they walked out together. He led her west, away from the buildings along the edge of the creek that ran down out of the foothills. The grass was just beginning to green up. Crocuses were pushing up through last year's brown stems and clumps along the bank. A meadowlark sang somewhere out in the pasture. They walked in silence for 10 minutes, and then they came to a flat slab of river rock at a bend in the creek, where the water made a soft turning sound, and Silas stopped. He turned to face her. His good hand reached down and took hers. I have been waiting 7 months to say this, Cordelia. I have been waiting because I wanted you to have time to grieve Theodore properly. But I cannot wait any longer. I love you. I am not asking to take his place. No man could take his place, and no man should try. I am only asking to walk beside you for whatever time we are given. I want you to be my wife. Not because you need a roof over your head. You have had a roof at Whispering Pines from the day you came up the road. I am asking because I need you. I need you to make my life mean something it has not meant in 17 years. Cordelia Ashworth, will you marry me? She looked at him for a long, quiet moment. She looked at the silver at his temples. She looked at the green eyes she had first seen in the doorway of Jacobson's Mercantile in August. She looked at the hand with the missing finger joint, the hand of the captain her dead husband had pulled out from under a horse at Antietam. She looked past him, just for a moment, down the long slope of the home pasture toward the old pine where Theodore Ashworth slept under the wooden marker Barnaby had driven into the ground. Then she looked back at Silas Thornberry, and the slow, rare, warm smile that came onto her face was the smile of a woman who had at last allowed her own life to begin again. Silas Thornberry, I have been waiting since the night you held my hand on the edge of your sick bed. Yes, 1,000 times yes. He drew her to him then. He kissed her once very softly in the spring sunlight by the creek at Whispering Pines, and the meadowlark in the pasture sang again. And the wind came down off the mountain and moved through the new green grass with a sound like a benediction. They were married in June of 1880. The ceremony was held outdoors beneath the same old pine where Theodore Ashworth was buried. Cordelia had insisted on that. She wanted Teddy at the wedding. She wanted his presence to be part of the joining, not separate from it. Reverend Thomas understood without having to be told. Barnaby Kincaid stood as best man in the suit he had worn to exactly 2 events in the previous decade, both of them funerals. Dr. Absalom Whitfield read aloud a passage from Henry Wadsworth Longfellow about the morning star and the evening star being the same star seen at different hours of the day. Hetty Blackwell came up from Red Creek in her best black bonnet and wept openly through the entire ceremony and was unashamed of it. Isaac Garrick, the 15-year-old son of Tobias, stood to one side as the silent witness for the generation that was coming after. When Reverend Thomas pronounced them husband and wife, Silas Thornberry kissed Cordelia under the open sky, and the wind moved through the high branches of the pine above them, and somewhere down behind the barn, 6 Rhode Island red hens went on with their scratching as if nothing in particular had changed. But everything had. The wedding feast was held on the long porch of the log house. Cordelia had cooked for 2 days. There was a roasted lamb that Tom Brennan's nephew had brought up from his own flock as a gift. There was bread fresh from the oven and honey from a hive Dr. Whitfield kept behind his cabin. There was a small cake with white sugar frosting that Hetty Blackwell had carried in her own lap on the wagon ride up from Red Creek, and that nobody had been allowed to look at until the moment the cloth came off it. Barnaby Kincaid made a toast that nobody who heard it ever forgot. He stood at the head of the table with a tin cup of cider in one massive hand and his copper beard catching the late light. And he spoke without notes and without hesitation. I have stood beside Silas Thornberry through every storm a man can stand through fire at Shiloh, through the long ride home from Appomattox, through 14 winters at Whispering Pines when the only sound in the house was 3 men who had forgotten how to laugh. And I tell you tonight that I have never seen him look the way he looks at this woman beside him. He looks like a man who has come in out of the cold. So here is to Cordelia Ashworth Thornberry, who walked up our road in August with a crate of chickens and brought our captain home. Here is to her, and here is to whatever good years the Lord still has in his pocket for us. He drank. The whole porch drank with him. And Cordelia, who had not wept on the day she buried her first husband and had not wept on the day she shot Octavius Crowhurst's horse out from under him, finally let 2 slow tears run down the sides of her face in the lamplight, and she did not try to wipe them away. The years that followed are too full to tell in detail. They passed the way good years pass in long, quiet stretches of work and weather punctuated by small, sharp moments that the heart remembers forever. The first child came on a morning in late April of 1881, when the snowmelt was running hard in the creek and the first crocuses were pushing up through the wet ground around the porch. The labor was long but not dangerous. Dr. Absalom Whitfield, who had delivered nearly 300 babies in his long career, told Silas before it began that Cordelia was strong and the child was well placed, and that there was every reason to expect a healthy outcome. Silas, who had faced cannon at Shiloh without flinching, paced the main room of the log house for 9 hours and wore a track in the floorboards in front of the fireplace. Barnaby Kincaid stayed with him the whole time, saying nothing, just being present the way a brother stays present. When the cry of the newborn finally came down the stairs, Silas Thornberry stopped pacing and stood very still in the middle of the room with his good hand pressed flat against his chest, as if he were holding his own heart in place. Dr. Whitfield came down the stairs a few minutes later with his sleeves rolled to the elbow and a tired smile on his face. A son, Silas, strong and pink and angry about being out in the world. Cordelia is well. Go up to her. Silas went up. He sat on the edge of the bed and took his wife's hand and looked down into the small, wrinkled face of the boy in her arms. Cordelia, exhausted and pale and luminous, smiled at him. What shall we name him, Silas? You choose Cordelia. He is your son, too. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said the name she had been carrying in her heart for the whole 9 months. Theodore Silas Thornberry, for both of his fathers, the one who gave you to me and the one who is holding me now. Silas Thornberry, who had not wept on the day he buried his mother, who had not wept at Appomattox when other men were weeping all around him, who had not wept on the night they brought the body of Tobias Garrick down off the trail, looked at his wife and his son, and wept openly without shame for the first time in his adult life. That was how Theodore Silas Thornberry came into the world. In the summer of 1882, Barnaby Kincaid married a young school teacher, widow from Red Creek, named Clementine Whitworth. Clementine had a 5-year-old son of her own from her first marriage, a boy named August, and Barnaby loved that boy as if he had made him with his own 2 hands. The wedding was held at Whispering Pines. Barnaby cried through his vows and was unashamed of it. In 1883, Dr. Absalom Whitfield opened a small clinic in Red Creek. It was the first clinic in the territory that served all comers, regardless of color or station. Hetty Blackwell, by then 74 years old, became his first regular patient and his fiercest defender against any townsman who muttered. She lived another 8 years, long enough to see the clinic grow into something the whole valley relied on. In the spring of 1884, Cordelia gave birth to a daughter. They named her Hetty Rose Thornberry, and the old woman in Red Creek wept when she was told and demanded the right to be called grandmother. Nobody dared tell her no. In 1885, Barnaby and Clementine had a son of their own. They named him Gideon Kincaid after the brother who had died at Shiloh at 17. Barnaby held that baby in his enormous freckled hands and looked down into his small face and wept again. And Clementine kissed her husband's forehead and said nothing because nothing needed to be said. In 1886, Cordelia gave birth to her 3rd child, another boy. They named him Edmund Whitfield Thornberry, after her father in Boston and after the doctor who had become the godfather of every Thornberry child. Dr. Whitfield held the boy, and his lined face went soft in a way none of them had ever seen, and he said quietly that no namesake had ever honored him more. That same year, on a warm evening in the 2nd week of July, the family of Whispering Pines gathered on the front porch of the log house to watch the sun go down behind the bitterroots. Cordelia, 31 years old, sat on the porch step with the sleeping infant Edmund in a basket beside her. Beside her on the step sat Silas, 46, now his black hair, more silver than not at the temples, his cane resting against the porch rail, because he still needed it on long days, but not on short ones. Out in the front yard, 5-year-old Theodore Silas Thornberry was chasing the ranch dog in slow circles around the watering trough. 2-year-old Hetty Rose was sitting on the planks at her father's feet, very seriously trying to put her own small boots on the wrong feet. Barnaby came up the porch steps carrying his copper-haired 1-year-old Gideon on one massive arm and pulling along his stepson August, now 10, with the other hand. Clementine followed, laughing at something Barnaby had just said. Dr. Whitfield was already in the rocking chair at the far end of the porch. His pipe lit a copy of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass open across his knee. The book had been a birthday gift from Cordelia 3 years before. Silas put his good arm around Cordelia's shoulders. Do you remember the day you came up the road from Red Creek with that crate of chickens? She laughed softly. I remember it. I thought I had come here to find justice for Teddy. I did not know I had come here to find a whole new life. Do you have any regrets, Cordelia? She looked out across the home pasture toward the chicken coop where the descendants of the original 6 Rhode Island Reds, more than 30 birds now, were settling into their roost for the evening. She looked across the slope to the old pine where Theodore Ashworth slept beneath his wooden marker. She looked at the 3 broken men who were not broken anymore. She looked at her sleeping son in the basket and her boots-tangled daughter at her husband's feet. She looked at the sun setting in fire behind the western mountains. "Silas," she said, "I came up that road carrying everything I had left in a wooden crate. I thought I had nothing. I was wrong. I had 6 chickens in a journal and a heart that did not yet know how to stop loving. That was enough. It was always enough." He kissed the top of her head. From his rocking chair at the end of the porch, Dr. Absalom Whitfield spoke without lifting his eyes from his book. "Silas, Cordelia, I want to say something before I forget. This is the most beautiful evening I have ever spent on this earth. Thank you both for it." Barnaby Kincaid let out a great booming laugh from the other end of the porch. "Absalom, 14 years I have known you, and you have never said a thing like that out loud. Now in your old age, you are turning into a poet on me. What am I supposed to do with that?" Dr. Whitfield lifted his eyes from his book at last. The lamplight from inside the open window caught the wire of his spectacles. "You are supposed to live with it, Barney, same as the rest of us." The whole porch laughed. The infant in the basket stirred and went back to sleep. The little girl on the planks gave up on her boots and crawled into her father's lap. The boy out in the yard tackled the ranch dog and rolled with it through the spring grass. And the wind came down off the bitter roots and moved through the pines above the log house with its old soft whispering sound. And that whisper on that evening sounded like the name of a woman and the names of 3 men and the names of every child who had been born or would be born under the long protection of whispering pines. A storyteller's voice closes the tale slow and warm, the voice of an old man speaking to the people gathered around his hearth on a winter evening many years afterward. Silas Thornberry lived another 32 years on the ranch he had helped to build out of nothing in the spring of 1865. He died in his own bed on a cold morning in the winter of 1918 at the age of 78 with his wife's hand in his hand. His last words were, "Teddy, thank you." He was buried beneath the old pine beside the wooden marker of Theodore Ashworth, and there was nothing strange about that to anyone who knew the family. Cordelia followed him 11 months later in the autumn of 1919 at the age of 64. She was buried on the other side of Silas so that she lay between her 2 husbands beneath the same wide branches. Barnaby Kincaid became the most respected blacksmith in the state of Montana. His forge in Red Creek shod the horses of 3 generations of ranchers. He died in 1920 at 77 with his father's hammer hanging on the wall above his bed. Clementine followed him 2 years later. Their son Gideon took over the forge. Dr. Absalom Whitfield ran his clinic in Red Creek for 27 years. In 1887, he was elected to the Montana Territorial Medical Board, the first man of his race to hold such a position west of the Mississippi. He died in 1910 at the age of 75 in the rocking chair on the porch at Whispering Pines with his copy of Marcus Aurelius open on his knee. When Cordelia found him in the morning, she did not weep at first. She only stood looking at him for a long, quiet time, and then she carried the open book inside and laid it on the mantel above the hearth, where it remained for the rest of her life. Theodore Silas Thornberry, the boy who carried both his father's names, grew up at Whispering Pines. He went to law school in the East, came back to Montana, and became a state senator. In 1905, working with the old Marshall Burke, who was by then a federal judge, he wrote and helped pass a piece of legislation that protected small ranchers from predatory consolidation by the big cattle companies. The act bears 2 names. It is called to this day the Ashworth-Thornberry Act of 1905. Hetty Rose Thornberry became a school teacher and then the principal of the first proper school in Red Creek. Edmund Whitfield of Thornberry studied medicine at the University of Pennsylvania, the same school where his godfather had once trained, and came home to Montana to take over Dr. Whitfield's clinic. The Rhode Island red hens that Cordelia carried 2,000 miles in a wooden crate in the August of 1879 lived on at Whispering Pines through their descendants for many decades. The last bird of that line died in the early 1950s when the original ranch buildings were deeded by the family to the Montana Historical Society to be preserved as a small museum. The museum still stands. Visitors today can see behind glass the original wooden crate, the leather-bound journal of Cordelia Ashworth, the great hammer of Barnaby Kincaid still smudged with the soot of the fire of 1879, the round wire spectacles of Dr. Whitfield, the Antietam medal of Captain Silas Thornberry, and a single photograph taken on the porch of the log house in the summer of 1886. In the photograph, three men who had once been broken stand beside a woman and three small children with the western light on their faces. Beneath the photograph, in Cordelia Ashworth's own handwriting runs a line of caption. "We came here to find something we had lost. We found something better. We found each other." That, my friends, is the story of Whispering Pines, the story of a young widow who came west with 6 chickens in a wooden crate and the eyes of a woman who had buried too much, and 3 lonely men who had forgotten how to live until she walked up their road. It is a story about honor kept, and oaths held, and justice found, and the way a life can give you a second love after taking the first one, if you have the courage to open your heart again. The Montana sky is still up there. The chickens are long gone, but the story is still alive. Because in the old American West stories like this one are the stars by which we still steer through the long, dark night. Rest easy, Silas Thornberry. Rest easy, Theodore Ashworth. Rest easy, Cordelia. Rest easy, Barnaby Kincaid and Absalom Whitfield. The wind in the pines above Whispering Pines is still whispering your names. It always will.